be with you all once again. We've had a great day and we're winding down, but we're going to have a really interesting conversation ahead of us on the future of institutional engagement with crypto and specifically Bitcoin. I'd like to take a minute and just sort of set the stage. In 2014, when my former agency, the CFTC, first began a detailed engagement with Bitcoin specifically and crypto generally, the price of Bitcoin was averaging around $360 a Bitcoin. If someone had invested in it in 2014, today they would be sitting on a 27,000% return. Not a bad bit of business. And in fact, I think there's probably some folks in this room that may have actually enjoyed part of that ride. But just to give you a comparison, the same investment in the S&P 500 index would have yielded a paltry 193% return, while gold would have provided 126%, and 10-year US Treasuries would have delivered 86% return. And if we just look at the past year, 2024, the average price of Bitcoin went from around $39,000 to over $94,000. It was the top performing asset class, rising about 125%. And again, by comparison, the S&P 500 grew 23%, surpassing gold at 32% and the S&P at 28%. Pretty impressive returns for Bitcoin, not only over a decade, but even over the past year. So that's sort of the economic, financial setting. Let me take a look at the policy setting. We've had 4 years, as we've talked about earlier today, of US government policy of really increasing antagonism and outright hostility to crypto generally and Bitcoin specifically. And yet we're now on the cusp of a dramatic change. Ending the hostility itself is a big deal. From my conversations with the incoming Trump administration, I think we can expect quite immediately, I mean immediately as in the next 2 weeks, the end of crypto debanking, the end of hostility to crypto self-custody, as well as an end of hostility to crypto institutional custody, the end of crypto regulation by enforcement, and importantly, the beginning of a US federal Bitcoin stockpile, but as well as a state stockpile. Right now, 14 US states are working to introduce strategic Bitcoin stockpile legislation, and 5 states have already introduced it and are lining up votes, and they expect to have those votes in the next few weeks. So that's the policy backdrop, that's the economic backdrop. Against that backdrop, what I'd like to do is introduce a great panel to talk to you about the future of institutional adoption of Bitcoin. And with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Vanessa Grellet, Pascal, Gauthier, and Fred Thiel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa Grellet. I'm the managing partner of Arche Capital. We're an early-stage fund focused at the intersection of public blockchains and financial services, focusing really on the institutional and wider adoption of blockchain technology. And we have a specific interest on the liquid side with Bitcoin and other blue-chip crypto as we're trying to figure out how to take a position, how to protect it, and happy to talk about that today.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. Pascal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pascal Gauthier. I'm CEO at Ledger. At Ledger, we are a security company. We provide security for consumers and enterprise. If you have a Ledger in this room, raise your hand. Let's see. Okay, so not bad. Ledger.com for those that didn't raise their hands. We got 2 new products called Flex and Stacks, and they're beautiful.
Hi, I'm Fred Thiel, Chairman and CEO of Mara Holdings, formerly known as Marathon Digital Holdings, one of the world's largest publicly traded Bitcoin miners, but we do a lot more than that. We do everything from own and operate wind farms in Texas to generating energy off of flared gas in various parts of the US, to heating 80,000 homes in Finland with the heat from our data centers. And we operate 17 data centers across 4 continents and really are focused on digital energy. We're also the second largest publicly traded company holder of Bitcoin, with today approximately 45,000 Bitcoin on the balance sheet.
Thanks, Fred. You know, we're going to take very much a global view in what we talk about, but I do want to begin with the United States, the end of a very repressive policy period we've been in. In many ways, the Biden administration and Gary Gensler in particular actually gave cover to institutions to not engage with crypto. With the end of that, are we entering a period where institutions will actually risk reputational risk by not having an engagement strategy with Bitcoin? Vanessa.
Yeah, so I think there's different aspects of what it means to be engaged in Bitcoin. I think you have the public company policy where you bring that into your balance sheet, and that's kind of like a treasury management, and then you have the upside related to the valuation of this. And then there's also leveraging public blockchains for enterprise, which has been held back also indirectly through the positioning of that. And I think we're pretty excited about how that's going to shift. Yeah. Because if all public companies and all financial services shift to public blockchains, whether it's Bitcoin or others, there's going to be a huge adoption. I think it's going to be like a 10 to 20 years shift, but we're only at the beginning of that.
Yeah. Pascal, in many ways, I think your business has attracted people who are concerned about government hostility. How do you see maybe the end of that hostility affecting your world?
I don't know. Last year or the years that we've been through weren't so terrible in the end. If you think about it, in the US, you do have Coinbase, who's been a public company for a few years now, with a great valuation today. And so they've been through sort of the motion, and they behave like the adult in the room that we're expecting them to be. And so they did a great job there. You have Kraken, you have Gemini. So if you think about, and you compare it to Europe, for example, but look at the landscape in the US, even after the Biden administration, it is not that bad. What was interesting for us is, usually when you think about, policies, we are not under the regulation part at Ledger, because self-custody is something different. And actually, this year I think we're going to stop saying self-custody, because it always triggers this notion of finance. And instead, we're going to talk about digital property, individual digital property. And I think this is what happened, actually, during the presidential. For us, the big news was not so much, the US is back in the game, because quite frankly, what happened with the ETF and BlackRock was phenomenal, and you didn't need like a new administration to do this. But what happened during the election is that suddenly, to be able to own something digitally has been promoted at the top of the agenda, and I think it became something like of a fundamental right. And for us, call me biased, but this is probably one of the most important things that happened in 24 and as we enter in 25. And this possibility of being self-sovereign and have your digital stuff with you, I think this is how we're moving into 25. This is what's exciting for me.
Fred, I think that probably what Pascal's saying appeals to you, because you think about crypto in many ways as storage for value, right? Turning electrons into value, other ways of storing value. So it's not just finance, right?
No, absolutely. If you think about Bitcoin mining, we're really in the energy business. Right? We're all focused on finding stranded energy that we can optimize and monetize. And because we're driven to be super efficient, we're constantly looking for better ways of doing that. Bitcoin for us is a means to an end. Now, as a company, we chose to have Bitcoin as our strategic reserve asset, similar to a MicroStrategy. Yeah. When you look across the US today, you have MicroStrategy with almost 500,000 Bitcoin. You have the other publicly traded companies that have about 140,000, 150,000 Bitcoin. We represent 45,000 of that number. And then you have about 350,000, 360,000 private companies that hold Bitcoin. So basically 1 million Bitcoin are held by corporate treasuries of US companies alone. That's 5% of all the available Bitcoin. Now, we believe that as you look at Bitcoin becoming more broadly adopted and realize Microsoft had a shareholder put on their ballot, Bitcoin is a treasury. Meta has now just had that happen yesterday. I believe that within the next 90 days, we will see 2 large US corporations announce that they're going to start putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And the minute that happens, the floodgates break, because now it's all of a sudden it's acceptable.
Yeah.
Right? You have the FASB rules that have changed that enable it. So I only see this going that way. And then the strategic reserve is a whole other ballgame.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's turn to the strategic reserve, and I really want to get all your views. But Fred, just the other night, you were talking about how the strategic reserves really become an extension of monetary policy for central banks and for the Treasury. Would you talk a little bit? I think the audience would like to hear about that.
Sure. So if you think about the U.S. today has gold reserves. That's not because the dollar is backed by gold. It's so that they can defend the dollar if it gets attacked. The U.S. has a strategic petroleum reserve. They're one of the largest producers of oil in the world. It's not because they're afraid they're going to run out of oil. It's so that they can manipulate the price of oil in the event of a crisis. If the U.S. were to hold a strategic amount of Bitcoin, then when you have countries like the BRICS who have announced that they want to de-dollarize and they want to essentially leverage Bitcoin as a vehicle for de-dollarizing, the threat of the US having a large amount of Bitcoin that they could deploy into the marketplace to potentially impact pricing negatively, together with the combination of what we call block space. Bitcoin, the network, processes one block every 10 minutes. And each block is won by one miner, who then has the opportunity to assemble the transactions. They choose the transactions that go into that block, and then that block is minted. Today, 40% of Bitcoin mining hash rate globally is in the US, which means 4 out of every 10 blocks are mined by a US company. Now imagine what would happen if China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, etc., invested huge amounts of money to grow their Bitcoin mining hash rate to the point where the US came down to about 10%. The US could do nothing to keep them from processing transactions because they would operate 9 out of every 10 blocks. But if the US were to invest and have 50, 60% of Bitcoin mining domestically, remember, China used to have over 78% of Bitcoin mining hash rate in its country before, then the US could control effectively 6 out of every 10 blocks. Which means that if Russia needed to pay China and there was a situation where the US wanted to create havoc, they could essentially announce that any wallet on that particular list could be blocked and US miners would process everybody else's transactions but those. And that's where Bitcoin all of a sudden becomes a weapon of national security, and Bitcoin as a strategic reserve is part of that tool set.
Wow. Wow. Let's build on that a little bit. Vanessa.
I was thinking more of the price impact of that and the signal towards other countries. So I think if the federal government starts doing that, as you said, the state level, they are also trying to build up some reserves. And we see, pension funds, and then local governments also piling up into those instruments, and it's easy whether owning it directly or through ETFs, et cetera. Yep. So we see sort of a very positive effect on the price formation, and then we also see competition with other countries, whether it's allies or others, and I think we see a lot of people that, once the US starts, then the race is on for everyone.
Yeah, I myself did a television broadcast recently. It was asked about the stockpile, and the journalist was, this is so extraordinary, and I said, it's actually not. Countries have been stockpiling commodities since the beginning of time. Ancient Egypt stockpiled linen and wheat. China stockpiles a massive amount of different commodities from pork to rebar. And the United States stockpiles not only gold, but petroleum and others. Nations stockpile key commodities in order to control the price, in order to level out supply and demand. So it's not that unusual. What makes it unique is that this is the world's first digital commodity, and for the first time, nations and individual states are realizing that there's value in being able to stockpile. So I don't find it that unusual, but it is what makes it unique is the first digital one. Pascal, yeah.
No, I just have a question, because in your scenario, then it means kind of that you have a state controlling the network and telling the network what to do, what not to do. So, which defies like the censorship-resistant nature of Bitcoin, and so therefore, that would, I think, put the price to zero very quickly.
Well, I think a couple of things happen. One is you're going to see a decentralization of mining into every single device that somehow stores or consumes energy. Every battery system will have Bitcoin mining as an arbitrage tool to essentially monetize the stranded electrons. Every data center, every AI data center that's being built today, think of all the gigawatts of power, they are going to have Bitcoin mining as a load balancer at those data centers. And you're going to see more and more Bitcoin mining spread out in microgrids. We've invested in companies that deploy solar systems on homes that has a little bit of Bitcoin mining. So now you have millions of homes. You're going to get more and more mining on zero-cost energy. Because it's not about mining off of grid energy. That's old school. The future of Bitcoin mining is it's part of every little device you have. I mean, this is what Block is focused on. They're focused on the consumer side of this. We're focused on kind of the mid-industrial, microgrid and upscale piece of this. But that will decentralize mining globally. The question is then who controls the pool where all that mining hash rate goes? It's not who controls the mining, it's who controls the pool. And a miner can switch the focus of what pool they use like that. So a government might say anything mined in this pool in the United States has to comply with OFAC, and miners can simply change where their pool goes. Now, does that mean publicly traded miners aren't going to get attacked by the government and regulators? Yeah, absolutely they would. That doesn't affect the price of Bitcoin. So I don't see this as being anything that negatively could impact the price of Bitcoin. I see it negatively impacting companies like ours or other companies that are under government control. As a publicly traded company, think the regime that we're now exiting, we had 800 comment letters from Gary Gensler about nitpicky stuff that we had to deal with, and our finance team, our CFO sitting here in the audience, did an awesome job of kind of combating that and dealing with it. So we're always going to suffer from regulatory risk and control. Even potentially your company could suffer from it, right? And so that's just part of the game, part of the stakes that we play in this industry.
So I want to overlay on this conversation about government control and whether it centralizes or decentralizes another layer of government impact on Bitcoin, and that is currency debasement. We sadly live in a time when 1 out of every 4 US dollars has been printed in the last 4 years. And the United States is not alone in debasing its reserve currency. Virtually every other reserve currency nation, maybe with the exception of Switzerland, has been engaged in the same game. What is the impact of that on Bitcoin? Is it entirely positive, or could there be some negative implications of that as well?
I mean,
and jump ball, everybody jump in on this.
I think the Bitcoin has this interesting feature, which is why pension funds, hedge funds, and others find it a very interesting asset. Its correlation changes on a regular basis. Right now, it's correlated to equities and risk on markets. It's also highly correlated to M2 on a global scale. It's highly correlated to interest rates, things that affect where people are going to allocate their money. And is there a big fear index? Then people want to put money in Bitcoin. And I think as Jerome Powell said, Bitcoin isn't a risk to the US dollar's control of the world. It's a risk to gold because it has more characteristics akin to gold. But I think what happens is if you think about a world where you go into fiscal dominance of economies, we are entering a phase on a macroeconomic world level where fiscal finance is what drives inflation. It is not commercial and consumers. The central bank in the US could raise interest rates, and the person they're really harming are themselves because you look at this last rate hike cycle. In Europe, all the people with mortgages, because they're all variable rate mortgages, would have been impacted, and yes, you could have definitely put a damper on spending. In the US, I don't know what the percentage is, 40% of mortgages are at fixed rate, 60% of mortgages are at fixed rate, 2%, I don't care what interest rates are. Well, what happens is when the government prints money, it inflates assets. It doesn't put more money into the economy, which means it harms the low-income, middle class, and it benefits people who have cash and can hold assets like real estate, like equities, like Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And it only will benefit Bitcoin and will only drive the price and value of Bitcoin up because there will be this race to accumulate Bitcoin as long as that printer is going whir.
Yeah.
So
Vanessa.
I agree with you on the impact of the interest rates. I would tend to disagree on sort of the analogy to digital gold. I think that asset class behaves more like NASDAQ on steroids rather than gold. And you see that in the recent years as the rates went up. The gold performed well, but not Bitcoin back in 2022, 23. And then we see the volatility is very different characteristics, 70% volatility on Bitcoin, 15% on gold. And so I would, that's the mental framework that I'm in when I look at Bitcoin. I know that the analogy with digital gold was very convenient at the beginning to convince the regulator, but also convince people who want to have like a first exposure to that. But I think of it very differently and as a risk on assets, and we'll see the impact of the interest rates in the coming year on that.
I think it really depends where you are in the world. I mean, that conversation really depends if you're Argentinian or French or in Zimbabwe. And so the impact of strong inflation is extremely clear, and we've seen it those past few years. As soon as your inflation hits like a two-digit percentage and up, you have a strong switch of people towards cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin for your saving account and stable coins for payment, and the usage of our products and products in general. The UX UI is different if you go to Lebanon than if you go to France. And so sometimes Tether is 200 million users right now and growing, so that's pretty good. And usually when you map out Tether users, they're not necessarily all in New York, and they are in regions where cryptocurrency is fulfilling its utility, right? It's a mean of payment, and you can actually pay faster, cheaper, and people are building real economies around this in those type of countries. So I think when you looked at the all-time high last year, the last all-time high was dollar just before it was euro, but before that, the all-time high in lira in Turkey was reached months before we reached the all-time high in dollars. So depending on where you are in the world, of course, the impact of your weak currency really definitely impacts the usage. And for us, this is what we need to keep an eye on. To my point about having digital stuff, all of this is not just finance, and all of this is not just speculation. All of this is also, it's a product, and what we're going to see this year is people building on top of a protocol. If you think about the web is not really your experience. Your experience is Facebook, and Facebook is an application that runs on the web, and social media is the application. And so more and more we're going to see these apps being built on top of protocols, and I think, especially on Bitcoin, with the price being so high, liquidity being so big right now, the layer 2s that are being built on Bitcoin will radically change the way that we engage with Bitcoin. It was already the case with Solana and Ethereum, but these look like little tests, and Bitcoin is still king. But as soon as you have DeFi on Bitcoin, this is going to be super interesting to watch.
Yeah, I want to stay with you for a second, Pascal, because your vantage point is truly global. Your customer base is in every pocket and every corner of the globe. What are some of the big regional trends, like when it comes to Bitcoin? What are you seeing in China? What are you seeing in the rest of Asia? What are you seeing in the Middle East? Because I know there are unique trends ongoing depending on their unique circumstances of each region. What are some of those that you're seeing?
You know what? It's a great question, but the answer is extremely difficult. Because for us, first of all, yes, we ship to every country. However, in order to penetrate some countries in terms of bringing hardware products there, it's much more difficult. And so our penetration in some countries is much lower than others. And if you try to map the world with what people are doing on blockchains, then you end up with a bunch of gaming in Thailand, for example, etc. But sometimes you have views that are not really representative of the future. From our advantage point, what we can say is, some countries are heavier on payment for sure. We are sort of discounted Bitcoin as a payment system, right? Which was, the principle of the white paper, and now it's really the store of value, etc. But I think things will change very quickly, and And for me, like the payment use case with stablecoin for sure, but with crypto in general, is something that is to watch in the next 5 years. I mean, it sounds old school and a bit passé, because we've been discussing this for the past 10 years. But I think payment is really something to watch. And so the reason why I'm saying this is because we are also pushing our products to evolve, to adapt to new usage, and typically payment is one that we are keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, very good. So speaking of how things change, I just want to read a series of announcements that have come out in the last 90 days about Bitcoin and ask you your reaction to what that may say about where things are going. So Newmark is offering term loans for real estate investors that include Bitcoin as part of the collateral package. The first ever Bitcoin real estate fund has been launched, 20% Bitcoin, 80% a portfolio of 300 residential units in Florida. MicroStrategy's offering perpetual preferred equity offering, allowing insurance companies and other large organizations to gain Bitcoin exposure. BlackRock is putting Bitcoin into its fixed income offerings. And Bitcoin life insurance has now been offered where the entire policy and payout is denominated in Bitcoin. These are just in the last 90 days. What does this tell you about the landscape we're going into?
Well, it's interesting. So Newmark, the commercial loan that was done, the Bitcoin serves three purposes in that. On the one hand, it's an incentive for the borrower to not refinance out the loan ahead of term, because they get to then share. If they refinance out, they lose the upside in the Bitcoin portion, which is 10% of the total debt. If it goes to term, then it's a 50-50 split, right? And so it also acts as a volatility kind of hedge against the underlying collateral of the building. So when you look at Bitcoin, people view it as this small sliver of the capital stack that can provide way outsized potential return and protection. And when you talk to people about pension plans, and I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not giving financial advice, but when somebody says to me, as somebody who's not living on a fixed income, that, hey, take 2% of your portfolio and invest it in this asset that may go to a gazillion or may go to zero, I'm already looking at maybe 20% of alternative investments in my portfolio. Some are like private equity or venture capital. They have long duration, they're illiquid. 2% in something, yeah, I mean, I'll take it. And then all of a sudden, you start looking at that by back testing it. And my portfolio, even using a 60-40 model, that 2% doubles my return. And so it's logical for real estate, logical for fixed income, logical for life insurance policies. You know, this is one I don't think you mentioned on that list, but people are basically, you buy life insurance with Bitcoin and it pays you back in Bitcoin. Think about this. What does that do to the equity markets? When the life insurance company only has to put their Bitcoin that you gave them in a ledger wallet and a ledger and forget about it for your life. They don't have to buy equities. They don't have to buy real estate. It has huge implications for markets.
Vanessa.
I think what's exciting about the list that you mentioned is the different possibilities for you to get exposure to this asset class as an institutional investor or as an individual investor. Obviously, you can buy straight Bitcoin, put it in your ledger, keep it as a percentage of your portfolio. But now you can buy products that are publicly listed companies. You can buy ETFs that you can put in your retirement accounts and get tax benefits on. And I think that's a huge avenue for the development of and the adoption of Bitcoin, because you did not have these tax wrappers or these vehicles that accumulate Bitcoin that you could get exposure to. And like Fred said, there's even vehicles where you can hedge the volatility of Bitcoin. So we're going to see more and more of that. Obviously, you have to think about the volatility, and it's not just numbers go up. They have been for the past 14 years, but I think as a really long-term investment and portfolio allocation, it's very exciting developments.
So Vanessa, rumor has it, it's just a rumor, that you may be thinking about a book in terms of telling people how to get exposure to Bitcoin. Let's take it down to just a very simple level. I don't imagine there's too many people in this room that don't have some exposure, but there may be. what are some of the ways to really expose, if we as many believe this story is a good one going forward, what's the best entry? What are some of the best entries?
So I think if you don't have exposure to this asset class, and I'm sure most of you already have, I think the easiest entry point is public equities and ETFs, because those are products that are easy to acquire, although it depends where you are. However, what we haven't solved for now is the incentives of the financial advisors to tell you to put this in your portfolio, because you have financial advisors in banks that only sell their products, and others who don't want to be bothered with complicated products or high-yielding products. So I think that's a layer that we need to work on in the next years, so that they don't feel like they're advising on something that's risky for their clients or illegal or potentially illegal, or that has really a negative impact. So I think the public listed products are really the easiest entry point. And then you have funds, obviously, that give you exposure, whether liquid funds or private funds that are also long-term. But I think if you come into this asset class, please try to come in with a long-term view, because that's where you'll reap the benefits of it. And of course, you can do ×2 maybe this year, but why not do ×10 over the next 10 years?
Pascal, what say you?
I would say I disagree. I think I would just buy Bitcoin straight up and not go through an ETF or anything like this. I mean, no disrespect to ETFs, but I think, as far as I'm concerned, if you enter this, you have several ways of thinking about this, but even if you think it's just an asset class, I'll still try and understand the way it works. I mean, for me, it's like, you're going to buy gold for the first time. You have the choice of having a nice piece of gold and, play with it, or, sign some kind of paper at UBS in Geneva. I think I have more fun, having my piece of gold and playing with it a little bit. And, with this, there are implications, because I think sort of getting into Bitcoin is not just getting into an asset class, because in time, I think a lot of the products that we're talking about right now that are being provided by the traditional financial market will be in DeFi. And so in order to access DeFi, you'll need to have your private keys somewhere, and so you need to understand the way it works. I mean, for me, the moment I understood Bitcoin is when I made a transaction. And then you understand Bitcoin. If Bitcoin is just to go to my banker and buy an ETF, I don't think this is Bitcoin, and I don't think this is the future. It certainly exists, and it's certainly good. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea. It's a good advice for some people.
No financial advice.
Well, it's not a financial advice, but I'm saying I disagree in the sense I think it would be best to test the product technology, and it's more fun as well, And I wouldn't go crazy. I'm not saying I'll take 15% of everything I own, but at least to do one small transaction and understand and document myself and read what it is, etc. And not to say that you need to become an expert in terms of technology, because nobody knows how to explain how the World Wide Web works, like the tech, the protocol. Nobody knows. But you do understand the implication and what this means for you and why it's good for you, etc. So I would definitely buy Bitcoin and play with it a little bit, and then eventually decide to put my Bitcoin back with Coinbase if I don't want to hold it myself, etc., etc. But I get used to digital ownership, because whether it's for Bitcoin or something else, I think inevitably it's going to be part of our lives, and so we need to re-educate ourselves a little bit in terms of what does it mean.
In the Bitcoin future, is it a future where there are dual approaches to custody, where some holdings are appropriate for self-custody on a ledger stick in your safe in your basement, and others are transactional uses and serve on an institutional custodian tied to an exchange?
Yeah, I mean, the future holds probably different futures and different possibilities. But to answer your question, I'll give you an example of a friend of mine who's not typically in crypto, that's not his job. But they had the choice of borrowing money on DeFi versus going to his bank. Yeah. He would never go to his bank again. He told me oh my God, this DeFi stuff is amazing. I go, I do this and that, I click and boom, voila, I got my loan, where if I had to do the same process through my bank, it would take months and years. And So I think we underestimate today the power of all of this, the power of DeFi, etc. And I think it's just because UX and UI kind of late. So we talk about Facebook, but remember Facebook in 2004, like the UX, and look at what it is today. I think we're still very early in the game, and so UX, UI are not exactly the way they should be, and so therefore and even the lingo that everybody uses is too technical, etc. So consumers, users, don't really understand. And they should not understand, because it's for us to do a better job at engaging and offering products and not technology. But as soon as the product is here, I think it's going to be hard to compete, and it's going to be hard to do it if you don't have your private key. So again, I think what we're trying to do is to offer an alternative. Right now, you don't have an alternative. You are the product of Google, Apple. Your money has to be at your bank, etc. Okay, tomorrow you're going to have an alternative and be able to hold some of it yourself, and probably you play with the two depending on many factors.
So, yeah, Fred.
I think there's another aspect to this, which is that as technologists, we always overestimate how quickly things will be adopted, and we underestimate the actual scale long term. What Bitcoin has that's very unique now is there is a product that is applicable to every single age category and every single income and wealth category. Most products are focused on a single niche. If you think about self-custody, tends to be more towards the younger, more technology-savvy Gen Z, maybe millennials. An 80-year-old grandmother whose financial advisor says you should hold a little bit of Bitcoin is either going to invest in an ETF or something like that. This is the first time you have a financial asset that every single aspect of the spectrum has a way to interact with it that they like, right? My kids love the concept of having a wallet and managing and doing all the stuff you talked about, because it's really cool, and they love playing video games, and so they do this stuff, right? My older brother, who can barely use an ATM card, he likes the idea that he can call Fidelity, and I'd like to own some Bitcoin ETF. And you have everything in between, right? Institutional investors have all these different instruments. So the TAM for Bitcoin is enormous. Mm-hmm. The opportunities for companies like the people in this room, yourselves and others, is humongous. Just pick your niche or your niches and go for it. That's what excites me about it. There isn't a product category to be in anywhere else in the world, I think, other than more broadly printed AI, that has the excitement for me that Bitcoin does.
All right, I'm going to do something really naughty because I didn't tell you about this in advance. I'm going to ask you for a number, just one number, okay? I began by saying in 2014, Bitcoin is about $360. Bitcoin today, it's, I don't know, 97,000. I haven't looked to today. We'll be back here next year. When we're sitting here the third week in January next year, give me a number where Bitcoin will be, starting with you, Fred.
224,000.
Pascal?
I mean, we never do predictions. So same, 220 something.
Pascal will blame me for this later.
I'm with him.
Vanessa, you're on the spot.
I would say the general consensus is around 200, but with the caveats that I think the year will be bumpy to get there.
Well, definitely.
So, try to think of when you want to enter that market.
Yeah. And for my part, I'll say with the Bitcoin stockpile, and the United States won't be the only one, I think at least 200.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Please give a round of applause for a great panel.